Chapter 1. Inquiry. Dialogue. A lecture generally means telling or explaining a certain subject, for you to be instructed, to learn. This is not a lecture. Here we are having a conversation together like two friends, perhaps walking in a quiet lane, full of trees and beauty of flowers, the singing of many birds, sitting down on a bench unfrequented, solitary, and having a dialogue, because we are concerned, both you and the speaker, with our daily life, not with something beyond, romantic and fantastic, because if we don't make our own lives clear, unruffled, non-chaotic, whatever we may do, it will have no meaning. So we must begin very near to go far. The near is what we are. Please, if one may point out, it is your responsibility to think together, not to accept, because one must have a great deal of skepticism, a skepticism that is not trammeled by fear, a doubt so that one begins to question not only what the speaker is saying, but also what you think, what you believe, your faith, your conclusions, your religion. One must have tremendous questioning, doubt, inquiry, through deep exploration, not accepting. Because throughout the world, religion has played an extraordinary part in narrowing the mind, in narrowing investigation. We are together going to look at many things that confront our daily life. We are not going to talk about any philosophy, any dogma, or encourage any faith, but with a mind that is questioning, doubting, demanding, find out for ourselves what is true, what is illusory, what is fantastic, and what is false. There are certain things which must be taken for granted. First, we must understand what we mean by communication, what the word means to each one of us, what is involved in it, what is its structure, its nature. If two of us, you and I, are to communicate with each other, there must be not only a verbal understanding of what is being said at the intellectual level, but also, by implication, listening and learning. These two things are essential in order that we may communicate with each other, listening and learning. Secondly, each one of us has, obviously, a background of knowledge, prejudice, and experience, also the suffering and the innumerable complex issues involved in relationship. That is the background of most of us, and with that background we try to listen. After all, each one of us is the result of our culturally complex life. We are the result of the whole culture of man, with the education and the experiences, not only of a few years, but of centuries. I do not know if you have ever examined how you listen. It doesn't matter to what, whether to a bird, to the wind in the leaves, to the rushing waters, or how you listen to a dialogue with yourself, to your conversation in various relationships with your intimate friends, your wife or husband. If we try to listen, we find it extraordinarily difficult, because we are always projecting our opinions and ideas, our prejudices, our background, our inclinations, our impulses. When they dominate, we hardly listen to what is being said. In that state there is no value at all. One listens, and therefore learns, only in a state of attention, a state of silence, in which this whole background is in abeyance, is quiet. Then, it seems to me, it is possible to communicate. Several other things are involved. If you listen with the background or image that you may have created about the speaker, and listen as to one with certain authority, which the speaker may or may not have, then obviously you are not listening. You are listening to the projection which you have put forward, and that prevents you from listening. So, again, communication is not possible. Obviously, real communication, or communion, can only take place when there is silence. When two people are intent, seriously, to understand something, bringing their whole mind and heart, their nerves, their eyes, their ears, to understand, then in that attention there is a certain quality of silence. Then actual communication, actual communion, takes place. In that there is not only learning, but complete understanding. And that understanding is not something different from immediate action. That is to say, when one listens without any intention, without any barrier, putting aside all opinions, conclusions, experiences, then in that state one not only understands whether what is being said is true or false, but if it is true, there is immediate action, and if it is false, there is no action at all. What we will be discussing is this: how are we to recognize the various activities of the self and its subtle forms behind which the mind takes shelter? We see the self, its activity, and its action based on an idea. Action based on an idea is a form of the self because it gives continuity to that action, a purpose to that action. So, idea in action becomes the means of continuing the self. If the idea was not there, action has a different meaning altogether, which is not born of the self. The search for power, position, authority, ambition, and all the rest are the forms of the self in all its different ways. But what is important is to understand the self, and I am sure you and I are convinced of it. If I may add here, let us be earnest about this matter, because I feel that if you and I as individuals, not as a group of people belonging to certain classes, certain societies, certain climatic divisions, can understand this and act upon this, then I think there will be real revolution. The moment it becomes universal and better organized, the self takes shelter in that. Whereas if you and I as individuals can love, can carry this out actually in everyday life, then the revolution that is so essential will come into being, not because you organized it by the coming together of various groups, but because individually there is revolution taking place all the time. Authority. I feel very strongly that each one of us, being responsible for the chaos, misery, and sorrow in the world, as a human being, must bring about a radical revolution in himself, because each in himself is both the society and the individual. He is both violence and peace. He is this strange mixture of pleasure and hate and fear, aggressiveness, domination, and gentleness. Sometimes one predominates over the other, and there is a great deal of unbalance in all of us. We are responsible not only to the world, but also for ourselves, what we do, what we think, how we act, how we feel. Merely to seek truth or pleasure without understanding this strange mixture, this strange contradiction of violence and gentleness, of affection and brutality, of jealousy, of greed, envy, and anxiety, has very little meaning, unless there is a radical transformation in the very foundation of ourselves. Merely to seek great pleasure or to seek truth has very little meaning. Man has sought that thing we call truth, apparently, throughout historical times and before, an otherness which we call God, which we call the timeless state, a thing which is not measurable, which is not nameable. Man has always sought that because his life is very dull. There is always death, old age. There is so much pain, contradiction, conflict, a sense of utter boredom, a meaninglessness to life. We are caught in that, and to escape from it, or because we have slightly understood this complex existence, we want to find something more, something that won't be destroyed by time, by thought, by any human corruption. And man has always sought that, and not finding it, he has cultivated faith, faith in a God, in a Savior, faith in an idea. I do not know if you have noticed that faith invariably breeds violence. Do consider this. When I have faith in an idea, in a concept, I want to protect that idea. I want to protect that concept, that symbol. That symbol, that idea, that ideology is a projection of myself. I am identified with it, and I want to protect it at any price. And when I defend something, I must be violent. And more, as one observes, faith has no place anymore. Nobody believes in anything anymore, thank God. Either one becomes cynical and bitter, or one invents a philosophy which will be satisfactory intellectually, but the central problem is not resolved. The central problem is really, how is one to bring about a fundamental mutation in this complex, unhappy world of confusion, not only outside, but inside, a world of contradiction, a world of such anxiety. Then, when there is a mutation, one can go further if one wants. But without that radical, fundamental change, every effort to go beyond that has no meaning. The search for truth and the question as to whether there is a God or not, whether there is a timeless dimension, will be answered, not by another, not by a priest, not by a savior, by nobody but yourself. And you will be able to answer that question for yourself only when there is this mutation that can and must take place in every human being. That is what we are interested in and concerned with in all these talks. We are concerned not only as to how to bring about a change objectively in this miserable world outside of us, but also in ourselves. Most of us are so unbalanced, most of us are so violent, greedy, and are hurt so easily when anything goes against us, that it seems to me the fundamental issue is, what can a human being such as you and I, living in this world, do? If you seriously put that question to yourself, I wonder what you would answer. Is there anything to be done at all? You know, we are asking a very serious question. As human beings, you and I, what can we do, not only to change the world, but ourselves? What can we do? Will somebody tell us? People have told us. The priests, who are supposed to understand these things better than laymen like us, they have told us, and that hasn't led us very far. We have the most sophisticated human beings. Even they have not led us very far. We cannot depend on anybody. There is no guide. There is no teacher. There is no authority. There is only oneself and one's relationship with another and the world. There is nothing else. When one realizes that, faces that, either it brings great despair, from which comes cynicism, bitterness, and all the rest of it, or, in facing it, one realizes that one is totally responsible for oneself and for the world, nobody else. When one faces that, all self-pity goes. Most of us thrive on self-pity, blaming others, and this occupation doesn't bring clarity. What you and I can do to live in this world sanely, healthily, logically, rationally, but also inwardly, to have great balance, to live without any conflict, without any hate, without any violence, seems to me to be a question which each of us has to answer for himself. Most of us listen to be told what to do, or to conform to a new pattern, or we listen merely to gather further information. If we are here with any such attitude, then the process of listening will have very little significance in what we are trying to do in these talks. And I am afraid most of us are only concerned with that. We want to be told. We are listening in order to be taught. And a mind that merely wants to be told is obviously incapable of learning. I think there is a process of learning which is not related to wanting to be taught. Being confused, most of us want to find someone who will help us not to be confused. And therefore we are merely learning or acquiring knowledge in order to conform to a particular pattern. And it seems to me that all such forms of learning must invariably lead not only to further confusion, but also to deterioration of the mind. I think there is a different kind of learning, a learning which is an inquiry into ourselves, and in which there is no teacher and no taught, neither the disciple nor the guru. When you begin to inquire into the operation of your own mind, when you observe your own thinking, your daily activities and feelings, you cannot be taught because there is no one to teach you. You cannot base your inquiry on any authority, on any assumption, on any previous knowledge. If you do, then you are merely conforming to the pattern of what you already know, and therefore you are no longer learning about yourself. One accepts very easily the path that is the most satisfying, the most convenient, the most pleasurable. It is very easy to move into that groove, and authority dictates, lays down, in a religious or psychological system, a method by which or through which you are told you will find security. But if one sees that there is no security in any such authority, then one can find out whether it is possible to live without any guidance, without any control, without any effort psychologically. So one is going to investigate, to see whether the mind can be free to find the truth of this matter, so that one will never, under any circumstance, conform to any pattern of authority psychologically. This is asking a tremendous lot, because we are educated, conditioned to accept authority, because that is the most convenient and the easiest way to live. Put all our faith and all our trust in somebody, or in some idea, or in some conclusion, or in some teaching, and give ourselves to that, hoping that we shall find some deep satisfaction, deep security, the guru. Those teachings have done all the work, and you just have to follow. Now, an intelligent person, fairly aware, awakened in the normal sense, objects to that totally. Living in a free country like this, where there is freedom of speech and so on, you would object tremendously to a totalitarian state. But you would accept the authority of psychologists, the guru, the teachings that would promise you something marvelous in the future, but not now. You'd accept all that because it is very satisfactory. So we are going to demolish all that, if you are willing, because otherwise you will not be able to awaken that intelligence of which we are talking. Where there is authority, psychologically, there is conformity. To conform to the pattern set by another through various sanctions, or the authority of your own, which you have experienced, which you have felt, and from that conclude and have security in that conclusion. Is there any security in psychological authority, in any teachings, including the speaker's teachings, the so-called religious teachings, and the top gurus, all that stuff. Is there any security in all that? And yet, if you observe, millions and millions are following that path, that way of thinking, hoping that eventually, someday, in some future life, or somewhere, there is going to be security. Now we are going to question and ask ourselves if in it there is any kind of truth. Please, we are working together, right? We are exploring together. We are really thinking out this problem together, so that I am not thinking and you merely listening, but we are sharing the thing together to find out the truth of this enormous weight that man has carried, hoping thereby to find somewhere some security and happiness. Please, it is your responsibility, as well as the speaker's, to go into this question very, very carefully, to find out whether one can live a daily life, a non-conforming life, non-imitative life, not following any particular tradition, because if you have got a tradition, a sanction, a pattern, you will invariably conform to that, consciously or unconsciously. When one is conforming to a pattern, religious, psychological, or the pattern which one has set for oneself, there is always a contradiction between what one actually is and the pattern. There is always a conflict, and this conflict is endless. If one has finished with one pattern, one goes on to another. One is educated to live in this field of conflict because of these ideals, patterns, conclusions, beliefs, and so on. Conforming to a pattern, one is never free. One does not know what compassion is, and one is always battling, and therefore giving importance to oneself. The self becomes extraordinarily important with the idea of self-improvement. So, is it possible to live without a pattern? The pattern being tradition, a conclusion, an ideal, an assumption that there is a divinity which will help you in the future to evolve, and so on. All that business. Now, how is one, as a human being, the total representative of all mankind, how is one going to find out the truth of this matter? Because if one's consciousness is changed radically, profoundly, no, revolutionized rather than changed, then one affects the consciousness of the whole of mankind. Please see the truth of this. Then you become tremendously responsible. Then you are not just worrying a little bit about your own particular little worry, whether you have a little sex or no sex, or should smoke or not smoke, all those kinds of petty little affairs. We are going to investigate together, whether there is a life in which there is not a spark of authority. How is one going to go into this problem? With what capacity does one investigate? To investigate, there must be freedom from motive. If one wants to investigate the question of authority, one's background says, I must obey, I must follow. And in the process, one's background is always projecting, is always distorting one's investigation. Can one be free of one's background so that it does not interfere in any way with one's investigation? One's urgency to find the truth, one's immediacy, one's demand, puts the background in abeyance. One's intensity to find out is so strong that the background ceases to interfere. Although the background, one's education, one's conditioning, is so strong, it has accumulated for centuries. Consciously, one cannot fight it. One cannot push it aside. One cannot battle with it. And one sees that to fight the background only intensifies the background. Yet one's very intensity to find out the truth of authority puts that background much further away. It is no longer impinging on one's mind. Are you prepared to investigate this whole question of psychological, external, imposed authority of human beings by other human beings to find the truth of it? Which means, to find the truth, there must be no motive, no cause for the investigation into the truth of authority. This is asking a tremendous lot, isn't it? Are we prepared for this? Or are we all too old? It doesn't matter. If you are too old, it is your affair. If you are not intense, it is your affair. I want to find out the truth of it as a human being. Assuming I am a representative of human beings, I say to myself, I want to find the truth of this matter, which is, whether one can live a life without any conformity, without any conflict, without having a goal, a purpose, a projected ideal, which all creates, brings about conflict. The intensity of the investigation depends on the urgency to find the truth of it, to have tremendous energy to find out. On paper, we can draw a blueprint for a brilliant utopia, a brave new world. But the sacrifice of the present to an unknown future will certainly never solve any of our problems. There are so many elements intervening between now and the future that no one can know what the future will be. What we can and must do, if we are in earnest, is to tackle our problems now and not postpone them to the future. Eternity is not in the future. Eternity is now. Our problems exist in the present, and it is only in the present that they can be solved. Those of us who are serious must regenerate ourselves, but there can be regeneration only when we break away from those values which we have created through our self-protective and aggressive desires. Self-knowledge is the beginning of freedom, and it is only when we know ourselves that we can bring about order and peace. Now, some may ask, what can a single individual do that will affect history? Can he accomplish anything at all by the way he lives? Certainly he can. You and I are obviously not going to stop the immediate wars or create an instantaneous understanding between nations, but at least we can bring about, in the world of our everyday relationships, a fundamental change which will have its own effect. Individual enlightenment does affect large groups of people, but only if one is not eager for results. If one thinks in terms of gain and effect, right transformation of oneself is not possible. Human problems are not simple. They are very complex. To understand them requires patience and insight, and it is of the highest importance that we, as individuals, understand and resolve them for ourselves. They are not to be understood through easy formulas or slogans, nor can they be solved at their own level by specialists working along a particular line, which only leads to further confusion and misery. Our many problems can be understood and resolved only when we are aware of ourselves as a total process. That is, when we understand our whole psychological makeup, and no religious or political leader can give us the key to that understanding. To understand ourselves, we must be aware of our relationship not only with people, but also with property, with ideas, and with nature. If we are to bring about a true revolution in human relationship, which is the basis of all society, there must be a fundamental change in our own values and outlook. But we avoid the necessary and fundamental transformation of ourselves, and try to bring about political revolutions in the world, which always leads to bloodshed and disaster. Relationship based on sensation can never be a means of release from the self. Yet most of our relationships are based on sensation. They are the outcome of our desire for personal advantage, for comfort, for psychological security. Though they may offer us a momentary escape from the self, such relationships only give strength to the self with its enclosing and binding activities. Relationship is a mirror in which the self and all its activities can be seen, and it is only when the ways of the self are understood in the reactions of relationship that there is creative release from the self. Ignorance is lack of knowledge of the ways of the self, and this ignorance cannot be dissipated by superficial activities and reforms. It can be dissipated only by one's constant awareness of the movements and responses of the self in all its relationships. What we must realize is that we are not only conditioned by environment, but that we are the environment. We are not something apart from it. Our thoughts and responses are conditioned by the values which society, of which we are a part, has imposed upon us. We never see that we are the total environment because there are several entities in us, all revolving around the me, the self. The self is made up of these entities, which are merely desires in various forms. From this conglomeration of desires arises the central figure, the thinker, the will of the me and the mine, and a division is thus established between the self and the not-self, between the me and the environment or society. This separation is the beginning of conflict, inward and outward. Awareness of this whole process, both the conscious and the hidden, is meditation. And through this meditation, the self, with its desires and conflicts, is transcended. Self-knowledge is necessary if one is to be free of the influences and values that give shelter to the self. And in this freedom alone is there creation, truth, God, or what you will. Opinion and tradition mold our thoughts and feelings from the tenderest age. The immediate influences and impressions produce an effect which is powerful and lasting, and which shapes the whole course of our conscious and unconscious life. Conformity begins in childhood, through education and the impact of society. The desire to imitate is a very strong factor in our life, not only at the superficial levels, but also profoundly. We have hardly any independent thoughts and feelings. When they do occur, they are mere reactions, and are therefore not free from the established pattern, for there is no freedom in reaction. Philosophy and religion lay down certain methods whereby we can come to the realization of truth or God. Yet merely to follow a method is to remain thoughtless and unintegrated, however beneficial the method may seem to be in our daily social life. The urge to conform, which is the desire for security, breeds fear and brings to the fore the political and religious authorities, the leaders and heroes who encourage subservience, and by whom we are subtly or grossly dominated. But not to conform is only a reaction against authority, and in no way helps us to become integrated human beings. Reaction is endless. It only leads to further reaction. Conformity, with its undercurrent of fear, is a hindrance. But mere intellectual recognition of this fact will not resolve the hindrance. It is only when we are aware of hindrances with our whole being that we can be free of them without creating further and deeper blockages. When we are inwardly dependent, then tradition has a great hold on us, and a mind that thinks along traditional lines cannot discover that which is new. By conforming, we become mediocre imitators, cogs in a cruel social machine. It is what we think that matters, not what others want us to think. When we conform to tradition, we soon become mere copies of what we should be. This imitation of what we should be breeds fear, and fear kills creative thinking. Fear dulls the mind and heart, so that we are not alert to the whole significance of life. We become insensitive to our own sorrows, to the movement of the birds, to the smiles and miseries of others. Conscious and unconscious fear has many different causes, and it needs alert watchfulness to be rid of them all. Fear cannot be eliminated through discipline, sublimation, or through any other act of will. Its causes have to be searched out and understood. This needs patience and an awareness in which there is no judgment of any kind. It is comparatively easy to understand and dissolve our conscious fears, but unconscious fears are not even discovered by most of us, for we do not allow them to come to the surface. And when on rare occasions they do come to the surface, we hasten to cover them up, to escape from them. Hidden fears often make their presence known through dreams and other forms of intimation, and they cause greater deterioration and conflict than do the superficial fears. Our lives are not just on the surface. Their greater part is concealed from casual observation. If we would have our obscure fears come into the open and dissolve, the conscious mind must be somewhat still, not everlastingly occupied. Then, as these fears come to the surface, they must be observed without hindrance, for any form of condemnation or justification only strengthens fear. To be free from all fear, we must be awake to its darkening influence, and only constant watchfulness can reveal its many causes. One of the results of fear is the acceptance of authority in human affairs. Authority is created by our desire to be right, to be secure, to be comfortable, to have no conscious conflicts or disturbances. But nothing which results from fear can help us to understand our problems, even though fear may take the form of respect and submission to the so-called wise. The wise wield no authority, and those in authority are not wise. Fear in whatever form prevents the understanding of ourselves and of our relationship to all things. The following of authority is the denial of intelligence. To accept authority is to submit to domination, to subjugate oneself to an individual, to a group, or to an ideology, whether religious or political. And this subjugation of oneself to authority is the denial not only of intelligence, but also of individual freedom. Compliance with a creed or a system of ideas is a self-protective reaction. The acceptance of authority may help us temporarily to cover up our difficulties and problems, but to avoid a problem is only to intensify it, and in the process, self-knowledge and freedom are abandoned. How can there be compromise between freedom and the acceptance of authority? If there is compromise, then those who say they are seeking self-knowledge and freedom are not earnest in their endeavor. We seem to think that freedom is an ultimate end, a goal, and that in order to become free, we must first submit ourselves to various forms of suppression and intimidation. We hope to achieve freedom through conformity. But are not the means as important as the end? Do not the means shape the end? To have peace, one must employ peaceful means. For if the means are violent, how can the end be peaceful? If the end is freedom, the beginning must be free, for the end and the beginning are one. There can be self-knowledge and intelligence only when there is freedom at the very outset, and freedom is denied by the acceptance of authority. We worship authority in various forms: knowledge, success, power, and so on. We exert authority on the young, and at the same time we are afraid of superior authority. When man himself has no inward vision, outward power and position assume vast importance. And then the individual is more and more subject to authority and compulsion. He becomes the instrument of others. We can see this process going on around us. In moments of crisis, the democratic nations act like totalitarian, forgetting their democracy and forcing man to conform. If we can understand the compulsion behind our desire to dominate or to be dominated, then perhaps we can be free from the crippling effects of authority. We crave to be certain, to be right, to be successful, to know. And this desire for certainty, for permanence, builds up within ourselves the authority of personal experience, while outwardly it creates the authority of society, of the family, of religion, and so on. But merely to ignore authority, to shake off its outward symbols, is of very little significance. To break away from one tradition and conform to another, to leave this leader and follow that, is but a superficial gesture. If we are to be aware of the whole process of authority, if we are to see the inwardness of it, if we are to understand and transcend the desire for certainty, then we must have extensive awareness and insight. We must be free, not at the end, but at the beginning. The craving for certainty, for security, is one of the major activities of the self, and it is this compelling urge that has to be constantly watched, and not merely twisted or forced in another direction, or made to conform to a desired pattern. The self, the me, and the mine, is very strong in most of us. Sleeping or waking, it is ever alert, always strengthening itself. But when there is awareness of the self, and a realization that all its activities, however subtle, must inevitably lead to conflict and pain, then the craving for certainty, for self-continuance, comes to an end. One has to be constantly watchful for the self, to reveal its ways and tricks. But when we begin to understand them, and to understand the implications of authority, and all that is involved in our acceptance and denial of it, then we are already disentangling ourselves from authority. To most of us, the problems of life are not very serious, and we want ready-made answers. We do not want to delve into the problem. We do not want to think it out completely, fully, and understand the whole significance of it. We want to be told the answer, and the more gratifying the answer, the quicker we accept it. When we are made to think about a problem, when we have to go into it, our minds rebel because we are not used to inquiring into problems. In considering these questions, if you merely wait for a ready-made answer from me, I am afraid you will be disappointed. But if we can go into the question together, think it out anew, not according to old patterns, Then perhaps we shall be able to solve the many problems which confront us, and which we are usually so unwilling to look at. We have to look at them. That is, there must be the capacity to face the fact, and we cannot face the fact, whatever it be, as long as we have explanations, as long as words fill our minds. It is words, explanations, memories, that cloud the understanding of the fact. The fact is always new, because the fact is a challenge. But the fact ceases to be a challenge. It is not new when we consider it merely as the old and discard it. So in considering these questions, I hope you and I will think out the problem together. I am not laying down the answer, but we are going to think out each problem together and discover the truth of it. Questioner: You are preaching a kind of philosophical anarchism, which is the favorite escape of the highbrow intellectuals. Will not a community always need some form of regulation and authority? What social order could express the values you are upholding? Krishnamurti: Sir, when life is very difficult, when problems are increasing, we escape either through the intellect or through mysticism. We know the escape through the intellect: rationalization, more and more cunning devices, more and more technique, more and more economic responses to life, all very subtle and intellectual. And there is the escape through mysticism, through the sacred books, through worshiping an established idea being an image, a symbol, a superior entity, or what you will, thinking that it is not of the mind. But both the intellectual and the mystic are products of the mind. One we call the intellectual highbrow, and the other we despise, because it is the fashion now to despise the mystic, to kick him out. But both function through the mind. The intellectual may be able to talk, to express himself more clearly, but he too withdraws himself into his own ideas and lives there quietly, disregarding society and pursuing his illusions, which are born of the mind. So I do not think there is any difference between the two. They are both pursuing illusions of the mind. And neither the highbrow nor the lowbrow, neither the mystic, the yogi who escapes, withdraws from the world, nor the commissar has the answer. It is you and I, ordinary, common people, who have to solve this problem, without being highbrow or mystical, without escaping either through rationalization or through vague terms, and getting hypnotized by words, by methods of our own self-projection. What you are, the world is, and unless you understand yourself, what you create will always increase confusion and misery. But the understanding of yourself is not a process through which you have to go in order to act. It is not that you must first understand yourself and then act. On the contrary, the understanding of yourself is in the very action of relationship. Action is relationship, in which you understand yourself, in which you see yourself clearly. But if you wait to become perfect or to understand yourself, that waiting is dying. Most of us have been active, and that activity has left us empty, dry. And once we have been bitten, we wait and do not act further, because we say, I won't act until I understand. Waiting to understand is a process of death. But if you understand the whole problem of action, of living from moment to moment, which does not demand waiting, then understanding is what you are doing. It is in action itself. It is not separate from living. Living is action. Living is relationship. And because we do not understand relationship, because we avoid relationship, We are caught in words, and words have mesmerized us into action that leads to further chaos and misery. Q. Will not a community always need some form of regulation and authority? K. Obviously, there must be authority as long as a community is based on violence. Is not our present social structure based on violence, on intolerance? The community is you and another in relationship. And is not your relationship based on violence? Are you not ultimately out for yourself? Is not our present relationship based on violence? Violence being the process of self-enclosure, isolation. Is not our daily action a process of isolation? And since each one is isolating himself, there must be authority to bring about cohesion, either the authority of the state or the authority of organized religion. To the extent that we have been held together at all, we have been held so far through fear of religion or through fear of government. But a man who understands relationship, whose life is not based on violence, has no need for authority. The man who needs authority is the stupid man, the violent man, the unhappy man, which is yourself. You seek authority because you think that without it you are lost. That is why you have all these religions, illusions, and beliefs. That is why you have innumerable leaders, political as well as religious. In moments of confusion, you produce the leader, and that leader you follow. And since he is the outcome of your own confusion, obviously the leader himself must be confused. So authority is necessary as long as you are producing conflict, misery, and violence in your relationships. Q. What social order could express the values you are upholding? K. Sir, do you understand what values I am upholding? Am I upholding anything? At least for those few who have listened with serious intention. I am not giving you a new set of values for an old set of values. I am not giving you a substitution. But I say, look at the very things that you hold. Examine them. Search out their truth. And the values that you then establish will create the new society. It is not for somebody else to draw up a blueprint which you can follow blindly without knowing what it is all about. But it is for you to find out for yourself the value, the truth of each problem. What I am saying is very clear and simple if you will follow it. Society is your own product. It is your projection. The world's problem is your problem. And to understand that problem, you have to understand yourself. And you can understand yourself only in relationship, not in escapes. Because you escape through them, your religion, your knowledge, have no validity, no significance. You are unwilling to alter fundamentally your relationship with another, because that means trouble, that means disturbance, revolution. So you talk about the highbrow intellectual, the mystic, and all the rest of that nonsense. A new society, a new order, cannot be established by another. It must be established by you. A revolution based on an idea is not a revolution at all. Real revolution comes from within, and that revolution is not brought about through escape, but comes only when you understand your relationships, your daily activities, the way you are acting, the way you are thinking, the way you are talking, your attitude to your neighbor, to your wife, to your husband, to your children. Without understanding yourself, whatever you do, however far you may escape, will only produce more misery